We negate resolve. The European Union should join the Belt and Road Initiative. Our only contention is the BRI. Despite China's massive investments into the BRI, China's economy is struggling to keep up. Garcia Herrero 17 from Bruegel writes that China's economy has slowed down and its bank's balance sheets are saddled with doubtful loans which do not leave room for the massive lending needed to finance the BRI. Despite this, several EU states have already signed on. Valero 19 from Euractiv News writes that members are free to join individually as nearly half of them have already done. Fortunately, the current flexible setup has enabled Europe to moderate China's BRI in two ways. The first is by halting predatory expansion. China is looking to expand its initiative to more of Africa, but lacks the ability to do so unilaterally. Thus, China has turned to Europe. Vanderputten 16 of the Royal Institute of Volcano writes that the Chinese government has shown an interest in cooperating with Western European countries on BRI projects in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Without European support, the BRI will fail. Xiang 19 from the Institute for Political and International Studies writes that France and Germany's support for the BRI is crucial. The success of it depends on a sustained flow of international investment, so China alone cannot ensure that this project works in the long run. The BRI is doomed to failure if it cannot leverage third-party financing. By joining the BRI, Western Europe will allow Chinese expansion into vulnerable African countries at the brink of a crisis. The second is by leveraging for reform. China's BRI is losing legitimacy internationally. Balding 18 from Foreign Affairs writes that China is facing a backlash to the BRI abroad as countries grow wary of Beijing's growing influence. China's no-strings-attached approach to investment has fueled corruption while allowing governments to burden their countries with unpayable debts. This backlash has created a legitimacy crisis for the initiative, with China unable to find other investors. Curtin 17 from the European Institute of Romania writes that without European cash, it is highly improbable that other actors would join China in the initiative. For a path to Europe to emerge, Europe itself is needed along the way. Because China needs the EU so desperately, the EU can use its potential participation as leverage to demand reform to the BRI. Curtin continues that China cannot financially manage such an ambitious project on its own. The only possible partner is the EU, and the EU is in the position to exercise its considerable leverage and make strong demands on China before getting to the actual build-up. Already, Kana 19 from Politico writes that because Europeans had so much to gain from the BRI, they successfully wrested concessions from China on cutting industrial subsidies and forced technology transfer at an EU-China summit in Brussels. Joining the BRI now, without exacting these demands, would eliminate Europe's opportunity to better the BRI. Smith 19 from the Heritage Foundation writes that endorsing the BRI lends legitimacy to China's predatory investment. Following Italy's decision to join the BRI, Switzerland also signed an MOU to the BRI, and New Zealand softened its opposition. Italy's decision could ease pressure on Beijing to reform the initiative, and critics have raised concerns about the BRI. Beijing had begun to internalize this pushback and have adapted the BRI in response. If the Chinese government believes it has assuaged such concerns about the BRI, it could weaken the motivation to implement meaningful reforms. The impact is a developing debt disaster. In the present, Stanzel 18 from the AICGS writes that because China's infrastructure investment often entails loans rather than aid, it raises the threat of a debt crisis in countries that already face debt problems. Overall, 23 of 68 potential BRI borrowers face the risk of crippling debt. Ultimately, Richter 18 of Business Insider writes that foreign debt creates a vicious cycle. As this debt becomes more difficult to service, the debt default risk rises, and foreign investors are even more inclined to stay away. When these crises break out, millions suffer. For example, Nerd 14 of the Leibniz Institute for Economics Research writes that when capital fled from countries across Asia in 1997, economies contracted and the living standards of millions of people worsened. Economic development was set back for years. Thus, we negate.